We asked AI to compare Putin's government in Russia to Trump's plan for the United States, and what we found is alarming, to say the least. But first, hello, welcome to Spin Cycle. Our mission is to get you out of your echo chamber and filter out the propaganda. We believe that Americans have more in common than what divides us. Help us break the spin. Now, let's jump in. To set the stage, we need to understand what Putin's government looks like, so that's where we started. We asked ChatGPT to tell us about the Russian government. Putin's government is what we'd call a centralized authoritarian regime. With elections, sure, but the kind where the winner is already decided. Think of it as a political theater, where democracy is just part of the set design. First, who's actually in charge? Well, technically, Russia has a semi-presidential system, meaning there's a president and a parliament. But in practice, Putin runs the show. The State Duma, their version of Congress, is basically a rubber stamp. Whatever Putin wants, it approves. And if someone in government steps out of line, they're replaced, exiled, or mysteriously disappear. And speaking of opposition, good luck finding any real challengers. Elections happen, but they're more of a formality. Candidates who might actually win either get barred from running, arrested, or poisoned. Sometimes all three. Take Alexei Navalny, a guy who tried to run against Putin, got poisoned, recovered, came back, then got thrown in jail for good measure. So if you're wondering, wait, doesn't Russia have free speech? Technically, yes, but say the wrong thing and you'll get hit with vague laws about extremism or spreading false information. That means fines, arrests, or worse. Protesting? Also illegal. Posting anti-government stuff online, that can get you locked up too. And forget free press. The government controls every major TV station. News outlets that don't play along, they get shut down or labeled foreign agents, which basically makes it illegal for them to operate. The Kremlin pushes a 24/7 propaganda machine, making sure the public hears exactly what Putin wants them to hear. Now let's talk money, because Russian politics runs on it. The economy is dominated by oligarchs, but only the ones who play nice with Putin. These guys own the oil, gas, and banks, but let's be real, they don't own anything. They're just holding it for Putin. And corruption? It's everywhere. Want a government contract? Bribes. Want to avoid jail? More bribes. The entire system is built on loyalty and money. And if all of this sounds a little too North Korea-ish, wait till you hear about Russia's foreign policy. Putin's whole deal is restoring Russian greatness, which means messing with neighboring countries. They invaded Georgia in 2008, took Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, then went full send in 2022 with a full-scale war. And outside of military moves, Russia loves cyber warfare, hacking elections, spreading disinformation, and trolling democracies worldwide. Bottom line, Putin's Russia is a dictatorship dressed up as a democracy. It's got elections, but the results are rigged. It's got media, but the government controls it. It's got laws, but they only apply when it benefits Putin. And if you try to fight the system fights back. Hard. That's the world Putin has built. And understanding that is key to figuring out how it compares to what's happening elsewhere. Okay, now that you have an understanding of Russia, let's run the comparison with Trump's plan. Alright, now that we understand what Putin's government looks like, let's compare it to Trump's vision for the US government, based on the actions he's already taking. To be clear, America is still a democracy, but if you look at the moves Trump is making, you start to see some eerily familiar patterns that line up with the way Russia operates. First, let's talk about power. In Russia, Putin holds absolute control. In theory, there is a legislature, courts, and elections, but in practice, everything bends to his will. Now look at what Trump is doing. He's been purging government employees who aren't loyal to him. He's rescinding executive orders from past administrations to erase policies he doesn't like. He's calling for more direct control over federal agencies. It's all about centralizing power, which is exactly how Putin operates. Next, checks and balances. The US government was built to have three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial, so that no one person has too much power. But Trump, he's openly dismantling those guardrails. He's firing watchdogs and inspectors general, the people meant to investigate corruption. He's stacking the courts with loyalists who will back his policies. He's signaling that he wants the DOJ to go after his enemies while protecting his allies, which sounds a lot like the way Putin uses Russian courts to crush opposition. Speaking of opposition, Trump's handling of political rivals is straight out of the authoritarian playbook. He calls the media fake news and journalists enemies of the people, just like Putin, who controls Russian media and jails journalists who criticize him. He encourages investigations into his political opponents. Sound familiar? That's what Putin does to people like Navalny. And he downplays or even encourages political violence, like when he pardoned January 6th rioters. That's a big deal, because when a leader legitimizes political violence, it opens the door for more of it. Oh, and what about all the criticism of Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett? MAGA is now threatening her because she decided to apply the law. Now let's talk about nationalism and economic policy. Putin pushes Russia first policies. He wants to weaken global institutions and isolate Russia from Western influence. Trump's doing something similar with America first.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
He's pulling out of international agreements, he's launching trade wars, he's weakening alliances like NATO, and he's promoting economic nationalism, putting tariffs and restrictions in places to prioritize American businesses, even if it hurts relationships with allies. But here's where things are still different. Unlike Russia, the US still has free elections, but Trump is working to erode trust in them. He questions election results, pushes voting restrictions, and claims fraud without evidence. That's how democracies start to shift toward authoritarianism. First, you weaken trust in the system, then you fix it in your favor. And finally, law enforcement and security. Putin's police force crack down on protesters and arrest critics. Trump doesn't have that kind of control, yet, but he supports law enforcement when they act against his enemies while attacking them when they don't serve his interests. So where does that leave us? At the end of the day, America isn't Russia. Not yet. Trump doesn't have total control over the government, and the US still has independent institutions that push back. But if you look at what's happening, Trump's actions are shifting America's government in a direction that looks a lot more like Russia's. More centralized power, weaker institutions, attacks on opposition, and a growing disregard for democratic norms. It's not a copy-paste of Putin's system, but the playbook, it's looking a little too familiar. Okay, let's not lose hope yet. Let's ask ChatGPT what we should do. So, if Trump's government is starting to look more like Putin's, how does America protect itself from slipping into authoritarianism? First, we have to reinforce checks and balances. The whole idea of the US government is that no one person should have too much power. But if we let the president fire watchdogs, stack courts with loyalists, and bypass Congress, that's how democracy weakens. Congress needs to step up, strengthen oversight, block mass firings of government officials, and make sure the presidency doesn't become an unchecked power trip. Judges should be independent, not just rubber stamps for one party or one person. So based on the first bullet, it sounds like we're good because the Republicans in Congress will ensure that checks and balances are in place. Why don't we move on to the next one? Next, we have to protect our elections. If politicians can change voting laws to stay in power, that's a huge red flag. Election fraud isn't the real problem, voter suppression is. Making it harder to vote or throwing doubt on elections weakens democracy and opens the door to authoritarian rule. We need to fight gerrymandering. Politicians shouldn't be able to rig the system by choosing their voters. Okay, that one sounds like we need to ensure that our leaders in the states are doing their jobs. How many blue states are there again? And speaking of corruption, we need accountability. If a leader abuses power, uses the DOJ to attack enemies, or pardons people who commit political violence, there have to be real consequences. Nobody, including a former president, should be above the law. And let's bring back the independent watchdogs, people whose job is to call out corruption no matter who's in charge. Wonder what the Supreme Court thinks about a president not being above the law. Now, let's talk about the media. Free press is one of the biggest differences between democracy and dictatorship. But if a leader calls journalists the enemy of the people and pushes propaganda over facts, that's dangerous. We need to protect investigative journalism, fight media consolidation, and teach media literacy so people know the difference between news and straight-up propaganda. Well, fortunately, we have all conservative media outlets that don't promote propaganda. Another big one, reducing political polarization. Right now, both sides see each other as the enemy, and that's exactly what authoritarians want. Social media profits off outrage. The angrier you are, the more you scroll. People need to get out of their echo chambers, learn how to fact check, and actually talk to each other instead of screaming into the void. And finally, America has to stay engaged in the world. Putin's biggest strategy is weakening Western democracies. He does it through hacking, disinformation, and cyber warfare. If America pulls away from alliances like NATO, it only makes authoritarian leaders stronger. The US needs to fight election interference, investigate in cybersecurity, and stop ignoring what's happening globally. Yep, I'd say we're probably okay here too. I mean, we did just stop monitoring Russian hacking or something. Sounds like we're covered there. Bottom line, democracy doesn't protect itself. If people stop voting, stop questioning, and stop paying attention, that's when things go downhill, fast. It's not about left versus right. It's about keeping power in the hands of the people, not just one guy. And if history has taught us anything, it's this. Once democracy slips away, getting it back is a whole lot harder. Fortunately for us, this was just an AI exercise. I sure am glad that the Republicans are in charge now, because they always talk about corruption and the economy. Actually, just kidding. We're in deep. Share with a friend. Be a part of the efforts in helping us break through the spin cycle and helping ourselves and others decipher fact from fiction.